thanks everyone. I know this is the worst panel to have. Everyone's ready for lunch. They've been sleeping. And so I thought I'd start with a little bit of fun and say, last year at Conservation Lab, we had a very vocal lady, and I won't mention names, but she was in the audience and she made a lot of noise saying how much we wanted to change Conservation Lab. It's not so diverse, there's not a lot of women. But I'm really, really happy to say, thanks to Paul, Ryan, and Serge, the diversity of the audience is amazing. You know, as much as we love you silverbacks, and I won't mention any silverbacks names, you're wonderful, but wow. And I want us to just jump up. I know you're tired. Jump up, give them a hand of applause. Thanks, guys. And I see the lady in person is here, so she must make lots of noise. Okay, for my panel, I'd like to bring up Beks from African Bush Camps. I'd like to bring up Paul he's Safari Professionals, a board member from Rhino Conservation Botswana, and Natural Migrations. We have Naledi, who is from the African Tourism Association and is involved in bringing together the wonderful African Summit, This is Africa. We have Klara, who is very famous and wonderful from Town and Country. And last but not least, we have Kelly. She's a manager of the largest youth radio station, Yarona FM in Botswana, and a fellow Tlhokomela Trust board member. So today we've talked about many issues of value of wildlife tourism, the value of wildlife to tourism. We've looked at socioeconomic factors, we've looked at revenue, we've looked at all these different discussions on value. And it's true, we know there's a value. The UNWTO did a study in 2015, call it what it was. It didn't reach as much as we wanted to, but it did come up with facts that wildlife is valuable. At the time when they were measuring it, on the African continent, tourism brought $34 billion into the economy, and 85% of that derived from wildlife. We know that wildlife is important. Later in the year, the WTTC is revising that idea and that study to see what today's value is in wildlife tourism. And I think it's a discussion we need to have. But when we looked at how we could bring in a different perspective on value of wildlife and the value of conservation for tourism, we wanted to bring in the question of PR. And so all the marketeers in the room, you'll love me. Have we got any marketeers in the room? I know we've got Nicole. There we go, James. Marketeers, going to love me, because one of our biggest issues is how do we say that we need more budget to talk about conservation, to bring in the bed nights, to increase the destination. It's something we can't prove, and one of the situations is that we actually haven't talked about it yet. We talked about monetary value, but we haven't talked about PR value. We haven't looked at marketing. And our panel, we don't have the answers. To tell you the truth, we don't even have the facts and figures. And coming from a wonderful organization like WTTC and not getting up and giving you facts and figures is difficult. But I think that this panel is to open the discussion. It's to look at new narrative. It's to look at different ways of messaging. It maybe is looking at a different messenger. And I think what I'd ask from the panel and from the audience is to keep an open mind. We are doing good things in publicizing conservation for tourism, but the answer isn't just that. There's so much more we can do. And if I could start by asking my panel just to introduce themselves and give you a different perspective of where they come from. In marketing, we have that 101, you have market segmentation. Who are you targeting? What are you targeting? And how are you targeting? So let's start with Beks. If you can give us an introduction of where you're coming from and why you think PR for conservation is valuable in tourism.
Thank you, Jillian. My name is Beks Ndlovu. I'm the founder of African Bush Camps. Actually, Jillian, I thought maybe I'd cause a bit of trouble and actually turn that upside down and say we should talk about the PR value of tourism to conservation.
Well, go ahead. You know you always like to turn things around, so let's go.
Jillian, I think what you said in your introduction is very true. How do we come up with statistics and actually, measure all of these things? We're about measuring and getting our return on investment on whatever it is that we do, whatever marketing exercise, whatever article, whatever PR exercise. But I think it is true that it's very difficult to quantify. But what we do know is that PR does, obviously the trickle effect is awareness out there, and certainly I see the value from two different point of views. Firstly, obviously, the value that we get as a business where we've positioned ourselves not just as a tourism company, but also as a conservation company. So we've now been able to attract the right kind of buyer, speaking to buyers out there, and expose ourselves to the trade as people that really care about the environment and the people surrounding those environments. And what that's allowed us to do is attract the right kind of clientele for our camps. So that's real value that then allows us to be able to make a significant difference on the ground. And I think as an industry, we can all say that the PR that we have as a result of conservation also attracts people from all over the world to pay attention to some of the crises and the issues that we face, and therefore allow us as a trade, as an industry, to be able to tap into those resources to expand the horizons and do the things that we are able to do as an industry. So the benefit of that and being able to create a song and dance about it has got a massive effect, personally, individually, and also as organizations, but as an industry.
Yeah. Thanks, Beks. So definitely value from that side of a tour operator, of an owner of a lodge. There is value. If we can now go on to Paul, and looking from the perspective of safari professionals.
Thanks, Jillian. So my name is Paul Swart. I'm the founder of Natural Migrations, which is a tour operation based out of the United States. And I also belong to an organization called Safari Professionals of America. So I'm not a PR expert, but we deal with PR every day because we are the coalface in the United States of anything that happens in Africa, because we deal with the clients when they book. And so any good or bad news comes our way. We have a crisis in Africa, and all of a sudden the phones start ringing, and we've got to answer the questions. So we need to be prepared at all times to answer questions on PR in the media. But I wanted to just talk about Safari Pros for a second and how we deal, what we're doing there. It's an organization of 27 competitors in the United States that have come together to grow tourism to Africa. And we have a common goal, and that is to increase the number of tourists to Africa and make a difference. And so how do we do this? PR plays a major role, but we also share best business practices with each other. So it's a strange setup because we all compete, and yet we're sharing information, but we have one common goal, and that's to grow the tourism. It's a fantastic, dynamic organization, and we have our own PR company that we employ. We generate over $120 million into African tourism every year, which is a substantial amount. And we have an incredible voice, a powerful voice, so we can make a real difference on issues that occur and support. We also identify what's important is our motto is that tourism done right equals conservation and community. So conservation and community are the strong driver behind our organization, and we want to be more involved. And we have 6 strategic partners. They're all in the room today that fit certain criteria to become a strategic partner. And one of those is that they're doing great work in the community and conservation field in Africa. And then we have a whole bunch of industry partners, and they also have criteria to belong to the organization. But, and so we use and engage with our partners on the ground to see how we can support them and also benefit from their PR and do joint PR initiatives. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we're going to continue with the industry. Naledi, from an African Tourism Association perspective, do you want to give us an idea?
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Naledi Khabo from ATA. And I know some of you are probably trying to reconcile the name and the accent. I'm South Africa born, US bred. I took over ATA earlier this year, and ATA is a 44-year-old organization. It started as a trade association of primarily tour operators and agents who are from Southern Africa, and over the years has evolved to include airlines, hotels, OTAs, the ministries, tours and boards, pretty much everyone in a tourism ecosystem. And I think some of the things that we've tried to focus on, aside from obviously member support and B2B engagement, more recently is really around advocacy and promotion and strategic marketing. My own background is in management consulting and digital marketing over the last 20 plus years. So some of the ways that we do that, and I'm fairly new to the industry personally, so it's been both a learning experience, and I think I've been able to look at some things with some fresh eyes, is identifying some opportunities and some gaps. What are the new audiences? So specifically, even when we're talking about conservation, how are those messages being communicated? Are there new audiences that we can communicate them to? One thing that we feel strongly about, whether we're talking about conservation or tourism in a greater context, is how are we targeting the diaspora? Because I think that that's an untapped market. And I think especially when it comes to conservation, there's a lack of engagement with them. So as a result, even when you see when they're making their travel decisions to the continent, it doesn't involve wildlife in most cases. And I think that that's just because that there's a disconnect. And I think part of that is the messaging, the messengers, diversity is important. I'm looking at it with fresh eyes, so while I applaud that the diversity seems to have increased significantly since last year, with my fresh eyes, I still look at the room and think this needs to be a more diverse room. So it's just how do we make these conversations more inclusive, and what are the more sort of strategic strategies we can put in place to get the messaging out. I think that wildlife and conservation, and in full transparency, a lot of the time the position we take is let's go beyond the wildlife conversation, because in the States, that when you talk about Africa tourism, it's primarily around wildlife and conservation and not around arts and culture and music and what have you. So being here even gives me a different perspective, is there's a lot to go even within conservation, and a lot more education in terms of from the traveler perspective in terms of its significance and why we should be having deeper conversations. Because right now, I think, especially on a global perspective, you get very high level, it becomes sort of the rich white man's conversation. And so then there's a disconnect. So how do we, even as an association, engage and help sort of facilitate better engagement?
Great. And Klara, I mean, Klara's a pro. Can you tell us a bit about how you
Pro at
worked?
what? I'm not sure.
A pro at PR in conservation and tourism, and many other things.
Is this working? I can't, yeah. So I'm the travel editor at Town & Country magazine in New York, which has a subscriber base of just under 500,000 and so-called pass-along readership of about 2 million. And that's, a very large audience. And in my role as travel editor, I cover conservation as much as I possibly can. It's sort of my personal passion and great interest. And what I was able to do in the past 3 years is about 4 major conservation stories. Major both in terms of the topics, I believe, and also the space the magazine gave me for it. So one story I did actually with Map Ives as the whisperer, who's sitting back there somewhere, which was a rhino translocation story in South Africa and in Botswana. And I was able to get 16 print pages, which is extraordinary in the shrinking world of media today. And the way we did it is, yes, we had to have a cover subject, a star, which was Uma Thurman, which was successful and not in many ways, but that's a longer story. But it gave me the opportunity to have a cover story on what was, yes, a celebrity cover, but absolutely a conservation story. And in terms of the effect of that, I know from Wilderness Safaris that they had about 1.7 million in donations after that story came out, from a number of channels, from readers of the magazine, from their usual donors, et cetera, from organizations. But I thought that was a really significant number. I was really pleased to hear about that. And then again, about a year and a half later, something similar, I went with African Parks, the NGO, to Malawi with Prince Harry, and they were translocating 500 elephants in the course of 2 summers, and I wrote about that, just being there for one part of it. And of course, Harry ended up being the cover subject, not fully intentionally, but we had a great photo and we couldn't resist. And that too had a large effect for African parks. So it's not really PR, it was journalism, but I think it really got the word out about what was happening with elephants in particular, but wildlife generally. And this is something I try to do in all kinds of ways. I did a piece on the Branda Resort in French Polynesia, using an entirely different world, but they have an extraordinary sort of back-of-house program, sustainability program, which is really a model, I think, for what resorts can do, what the travel sector can do when they really take that aspect of things seriously. So I hope all that helps.
Well, it certainly also shows that not only does the PR of conservation bring about travel and tourism revenues, but it brings in donations, which could have been a topic of this discussion too, where you're seeing PR support conservation action.
Exactly.
It's unfortunate we don't have Peter Allison here because he had a lot to say about Prince Harry last year, but moving on. Kelly doesn't come from a tourism perspective, but I think it's important to have more people within PR and media talk about tourism and where we're going right and where we're going wrong.
All right, thank you. Just a little bit about myself. As Jillian said, I'm not so much from the tourism and conservation background, but I'll just break it down a little bit about myself so that you can understand my story and why I'm here and want to share with it. Basically, on my side, I run a youth radio station with a segment of about 19 to 29 years, spill over to 35. And I was, I've traveled, I've, done a lot of stuff outside Botswana, but I was privileged enough to join the Tour de Tuli. And that's when I, got introduced to children in the wilderness. And literally from that experience, I fell in love with tourism and conservation. Literally from that experience, from a domestic aspect, that's where I actually got introduced to what is literally happening in my country and country surrounding. From then on, I was privileged enough to actually experience the Delta for the first time. I'm 33 years old, but I experienced the Delta for the first time last year. So when Fred was here telling his story, it just took it back to my side also on the domestic aspect of that, the only way to actually encourage tourism and conservation, we can write about it, we can put it on TV, we can actually show it, but unless somebody experiences it, it's going to be very hard to change the narrative and to change people's perspectives. So, the reason why I'm here is just to say, the youth, we talk about leaders on a day-to-day basis, but unless you cultivate the youth, those are tomorrow's leaders. We can have great leaders today, but unless you cultivate the youth and where we're going, it's going to be very hard to change the narrative indefinitely. Yeah.
No, and I think we're going to continue with Kelly whilst you've got the mic there, because for the sake of this audience, we know many of us have been professional and put out that PR message to some really wonderful campaigns. And I know whether it's James or Nicole, we've done some great things. And I just feel that maybe, and we're not allowed to be negative, but there's an opportunity to do more. There's an opportunity to do more with the youth and to do more within the PR space for the people that are living in the country where we're looking at conservation and tourism taking place. And there's a feeling that if we don't talk about it and we don't promote it as hard as we promote this conservation tourism message to our clients, then we are going to lose foothold in the country. So, Kelly, what can we do in terms of domestic marketing and PR for the sake of the people here to promote conservation?
Well, there's two aspects, right? There's the aspect of having influencers, people who actually could, experience it and go back and tell the story. It's always amazing to tell the story from somebody who's experienced it, and also a word of mouth. It's always one of the biggest PR sellers. The second aspect is also to change the mindset. We all know that everybody, when they speak about the Delta, they think it's expensive. And actually, that's one of the biggest narratives. Before I went there, as I said, I've traveled the world, but when I thought about going to the Delta, I always thought it's expensive. So we need to change the narrative of that it's accessible, it's not for certain exclusive certain people, it's literally for everyone. So once you change that narrative and open it up and start marketing it to everyone, we can change the narrative and ensure that conservation continues a lot more. It also needs to start at the grassroots, from primary, secondary. It needs to be introduced as a subject and something you can take and develop and teach. That's how I feel it could change on a domestic aspect here.
Do you think the industry can do more?
No, definitely. The industry should do more.
Should do more, must do more. There you go. Okay, Naledi, I think that it is a different aspect when we talk about domestic market, but it also rings true to conversations we had when we're looking at the African American diaspora in the US and in Europe. And I wouldn't want to say that there's a negativity. I wouldn't want to say there's a challenge. From my perspective, we're looking at an opportunity. And in the end, if you're filling beds and the PR work that you're doing is to create that, what could we do to market towards that diaspora?
Well, I think it's similar to marketing any product. I think the marketers in the room would agree that it's a product, so you have to think about the audience. Where are they? Where do they live? Who are the people that they interact with? Who do they respect? And then if you look at it as a product and you package it as such, you think about the different ways to reach them. I think that there's a lot of talk about the Black travel movement, and everyone wants to tap into those dollars, but they're not taking a step back to sort of figure out how do you do that in a really authentic way. I think, the most effective way is digital, and in full transparency, I was at a digital agency for 10 years, so I think digital first. But I think in terms of effectively impacting a significant amount of people with efficient budgets, that makes the most sense. I think it is engaging people who are influential, but engaging them in a manner that makes sense. Because a lot of time, agencies and brands use influencers, but then they don't necessarily use them properly. There's no strong call to action. There's no repurposing of content. What type of content is being produced? Because I think I've seen a shift even in the last few years in terms of different marketing messages by various countries, but it's still all very generic. And I don't care whether you're targeting families, the diaspora, retirees, or what have you. It takes work. And so you really need to tailor those messages to those audience groups. And I think that once there's a level of awareness of all the benefits of conservation, of the community engagement, I think over the last day, we've heard so many wonderful stories. I don't hear those stories in the States. And I think that the target audience isn't hearing those stories, and those are stories that they would connect with, that would raise their interest in, experiencing wildlife.
Yeah. And it's true, we're not seeing those stories, and maybe the messenger isn't necessarily somebody that the diaspora or Kelly's youth would aspire to. But there's also a situation that we have to be realistic, and from Klara's point of view, and I'm going to throw you under the bus here, there is a reality of why sometimes we might not necessarily see that Black influencer on the cover of Town and Country. There is a reality, which you can fairly say. What is the reality? Why, from your perspective, and that's not saying that there's anything wrong, that's your market and you're doing that right. So could you explain to the audience why you wouldn't always have the messaging that Naledi has asked for? You talk about putting in the space. You can't have a 16-page cover with maybe somebody from the community alone. So, but at the same time, are you putting that into those stories?
I mean, we have had covers like that. If we're talking.
So can you give us an example?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, we have had covers like that, perhaps not in relation to conservation.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about race and ethnicity right now,
Yeah.
right? And so certainly in Town and Country, we have actually a lot of covers every year, including currently, where African Americans are represented. So it's just that I believe that marketing to a Black American audience requires a different approach from the travel industry. I feel that so much of the appeal of lodges, it's sort of the out of Africa myth. It's the romance. It's the pictures of white hunters on the walls. It's not a comfortable zone, I think.
No, definitely.
It's not speaking to the history that African Americans have experienced.
If I could just add, I know from, the magazine business, they have to sell covers at the end of the day. And so depending on what that constituency looks like, it may not make business sense. But I think the idea is whether you're trying to target a Black market, a young market, or even just a new American market, it's identifying what those other platforms are. There's other platforms that are there that as marketers, we may not have been tapping into the past. So it's just identifying what those are, no matter who the target audience is.
So we're looking at not only the message and the messengers, but it's the how. Let's look at new modes of conversation. So we're coming back to Beks, and I had a discussion, and he said to me, well, maybe there's an opportunity here that, yes, we need these wonderful covers, we need these great PR campaigns that target the consumer, it inspires the consumer to look at conservation and traditionally book their holiday. But when we talk about new luxury, and there's been a lot of discussions within WTTC, within the UNWTO, ITB, all of them about travelers need to be inspired. They want to take the story home, and they want to know why they should care. And they do that by looking at people as well as the conservation message. And you said to me, what you would like to see within your sphere of influence was more people within the community facing the message. They are the messengers. And what can we do to promote those people forward?
Thanks, Jillian. So I think in terms of PR, we can all agree that any PR is fantastic PR, whether we have Harry on the cover or anybody that actually brings or draws attention to the continent. I think we're all aware of the shocking statistic, shocking but also presents us with an opportunity that Africa realizes very little of the world's tourism revenue, or at least the economy. Yeah. I think it's compared to Italy, which is about 3% of the
3%,
world's...
3%
I mean, that is a shocker for a continent like Africa. So I think going forward, we've got to take a little bit of a mind shift to say, well, how are we going to change this? We are presented with opportunity, and perhaps this next opportunity will only be realized when the people of Africa themselves can be facilitated to actually tell their story. I think the world lives on storytelling, and the world is ripe and ready to hear people tell their stories. And we can't say that, the stories aren't there. So when we talk about land use and the attractiveness of some of these marginal areas around some of the places we operate, if you're smack bang in the middle of the Okavango Delta, well, actually, you need very little PR. But if you're out in the middle of nowhere on the outer peripherals where there's no camp, but there are people living there, and there's other attractions, if those people are to be facilitated to actually tell their story, I think we'll begin to claw back and actually increase our revenue and attention to these places. Again, we can compare ourselves to a country like Australia. What does Australia really have that Africa doesn't have? And yet it probably enjoys a lot more of the tourism revenue. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done in that space, in that area, to say how can we get our people in these marginal areas to actually tell their stories enough that their areas become more attractive, and we utilize a lot more of Africa's spaces and increase the values of those areas.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about communities, we talk a lot about communities here, and one of the things from a PR perspective and even from a perspective of our discussions is, what is community? Because I feel that when we talk in this space, people talk about community as the people who live around the wildlife, around those tourism areas. But really, and that's why having somebody like Kelly on the platform, community is everybody in that country. It's not necessarily the person who lives in the Okavango Delta. It's the person who lives outside the Delta. It's even the person who lives in Gaborone. And I think bringing those messages, Beks, is a great thing, and talking about that.
Yeah, so Jillian, I think I'd add one more thing, not to throw the trade under the bus, but quite often people are selling Africa, and Africa is really sold on wildlife. So again, I think there's a lot of work there where perhaps the trade needs to tell a lot more stories about the people, the culture, and actually say, go out of the way to have that conversation. Yes, it's a hard sell, but actually, will people not become a lot richer if they learn a lot more about Africa? So there's a very big push with the trade being high influencers. I think we've got to get to a stage where everybody's having conversations to say, well, if we all want our businesses to still exist, we have to increase the value of the lands of the communities in Africa through getting people's awareness that there actually are fantastic places. And there actually is a success story. I don't know if there's anybody here from, and I'll be asking them for a check after this, but is anybody here from Uncharted Africa? No?
Oh.
Colin. So Uncharted Africa is, in a sense, they're one of the examples in Botswana that really, you go there for the most part, physically you see donkeys, you see cattle, But actually, when you're with their people, the place becomes alive because there's so much wealth, from landscape to the very small things that people don't often pay attention to. And they've been a very successful safari company, and not necessarily being smack bang in the middle of the Okavango Delta. So I think more of those kind of success stories are possible.
Yeah, and I know the Bushman walks, or I shouldn't say Bushman, the San people walks, but we promote it as Bushman. The meerkat experience, the sleeping under the stars, was something that's, even on an international scale, been widely PR'd. So there's two topics you brought up there. One is, what can the trade do? And we'll ask Paul to answer that, and how Safari Professionals is doing that with their PR partners. And the other thing about, yes, there's wildlife, but what about the people, which I'll put forward to Naledi. So Paul, in terms of Safari Professionals, you spoke about having PR partners, partners that you work with in country that then generate community-based stories from in country. Can you give an example?
Yeah, sure. Last year, our PR company that we've appointed sent a journalist across. Runners Without Borders were moving 40 runners from South Africa to Botswana. It's the largest land translocation ever undertaken, and Safari Pros funded the journalist and the photographer to cover the trip for Smithsonian Magazine, an exclusive for Smithsonian Magazine at that time. So you might ask, how does this benefit us as travel companies in the US, a story like that? Because there is no real, as an organization of 27 companies, there's no real call to action that we can put our Safari Pros, but who they're going to contact for more information. So the way we do it is we do these kind of conservation community stories, and then that comes back to us in a publication or online. And then we go to our database, and we have a substantial database of past travelers and travelers still to go, future travelers. So, and then you are promoting a conservation project in Africa through your database, and it's something to talk about, and it's something to raise awareness. The other thing we do is with our 6 strategic partners, is we donate an amount of money to their conservation community initiatives from Safari Pros, and then we require them to send back to us what they've done with it and the results. And then we send that out through our PR company to the media, but we also use that with our databases to promote. So it's getting out to the clients in America. So we're trying to set the example in the USA, in the Americas, Canada, anywhere in the Americas, that conservation and community should be the forefront of travel. You'll see the articles that come out in a lot of the magazines, and no offense to anybody, but I'm quite sick and tired of seeing a copper bath and ostrich eggs in a bowl in pictures in magazines. They don't include community pictures, they don't include conservation pictures. So it seems to be that it's all about accommodations, which are very important, most of the articles. The best lodges, all this kind of stuff. What is lacking in PR for us is more articles about doing good in Africa. Because if you look at it, most of the NGOs funded in Africa are by clients that have traveled to Africa. And so we need, and tourism is going to save the wildlife in Africa, there's no doubt. So we need to capitalize on that more through PR.
Thank you. So, Naledi, I mean, we talked about the whole adage of people come to Africa, they come for the wildlife, they stay for the people, and maybe if we turn that around and say they come for the people and save the wildlife. Do you think that's a possibility?
No, I do, because I think that's where the opportunity, I think one of the reasons why we see even the global percentage so low is that when people are making travel decisions, unless they're really thinking, I want a safari experience, Africa's not necessarily top of mind. I've heard even buyers at some of the trade shows here when they talk about, after thankfully going through a fam trip, I didn't know South Africa had so much culture and heritage, and to me that's astounding that would be their position, but I think that shows that there's a gap or an opportunity even in how we're educating the trade in terms of how we're selling various countries across the continent. So I think that by tapping into the larger audience of people who aren't even necessarily thinking about wildlife and then introducing it to them, that we can expand the opportunity, expand the potential audience members, because I do think that wildlife actually has an advantage in the PR conversation now from a global perspective, because when people do think of Africa, as we've said constantly, they think wildlife first. So how do we take advantage of that to sort of go deeper and then introduce other concepts outside of wildlife, like the people and the experiences and the things happening in the community? Because again, I think those are things that people will connect to.
Thanks. And then we're looking at this domestic market, which is something that back in the days when I was working at a tourism organization, there was a big drive. How do we get the people in the country to travel to the areas that are conserved and are for tourists? And if we look at domestic market and why, at the time, why we felt that it was important to talk about this was, yes, travelers bring in the revenue. Yes, if we PR and create buy-in, they will come and spend their dollars. But if you don't create support within your own country for what we're doing in conservation and tourism, you have a chance that your voters are going to change their mind. You don't have that chance where they think that it's okay to keep the tourism industry the way it is. So Kelly, we spoke about how you think we can change it, but you also spoke about going even further. You said to me that it's important to talk to people in country about why they should care. Because right now, if you ask them, why should we care? Why should we vote to conserve areas? Why should we vote to conserve elephants? So what needs to be done way back at the very start of this PR messaging?
All right, thanks, Jillian. What needs to be done is to be more engaging. If you have a buy-in of the product that you want to protect, and you don't have a buy-in of the locals or people in that country, it will never work. And the reason why I'm so big on also youth is I also believe that they're the biggest buyers of a lot of things, from insurance companies, telecommunications, you name it. The biggest spending power right now is actually the youth. And in Botswana, they make about 60% of the population. So this is a market that you can capture to actually tell your story tomorrow. This is a market that we could capture to actually tell the story even outside Botswana and invite more people to come in Botswana and help with the conservation. I'm big on saying that the narrative needs to change. It needs to involve, everybody, the communities, the government, the private sector. You cannot talk about conservation among just conservationists. You cannot talk about it. It has to be a platform that needs to be divided across all borders. It's not, I don't want to call it a battle or a fight, but it's not something that you can do alone. You will not win it alone. It needs to be open, and the dialogue needs to be out there, and there needs to be more education and more involvement in the community at large. And as I said, the story just needs to be told a little bit more outside books, more stories told from person to person. So that's how we can actually definitely improve it going forward. Yeah.
Jillian, if I could just get in here for a moment. So I wish African Parks were here. I don't believe there's anyone here from there this year. But I know that in Malawi, and these are stats that they gave me just recently, several of their parks have been sort of coming back from zero tourism, zero revenue, and so forth. Now collectively, there's about 4.5 million, and quite a big percentage from local tourism, particularly in Majeti and Liwonde. 50% of the visitors are now from Malawi, which I thought was extremely positive. That's the thing. I wish I had asked what it was.
I know that also with African Wildlife Foundation and the work they've done in Kenya, it's also promoting the domestic market. And it is a growth market. And we have to see it as an opportunity. In the end, it's still people coming to your lodge and conserving the wildlife. I can see everyone's sleeping, and we've got 10 minutes. So no sleeping, because we're going to talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant, not the stork, but we're going to talk about one of those. But before that, communities. I think that there's some wonderful people in the community, and I would like this opportunity to highlight them. I know that Tlhokomela Trust has sponsored 3 community members. Izzy, if you stand up, he's from Elephants Without Borders. Tumi, please stand up, she's from Travel for Impact. And Bongani, where is Bongani? Yeah, Children of the Wilderness. So give them a round of applause, please. our purpose is to just start dialogue, whether it's on a PR dialogue, whatever the dialogue is, please, let's involve more community. So thanks for that opportunity, Ryan. Okay, elephant in the room. Crisis. And we're not allowed to talk about negativity, but what happens when things don't go where the perception feels that it's not correct in conservation? We're not going to talk about what's correct or not, but what is the perception that something isn't right? Whether it's the Cecil story, whether it's rhinos being poached in Kruger, whether it's Botswana elephants being poached, and the discussion on hunting. And I know that we couldn't bring this up without having this discussion. So Beks, one of the things we talked about, I think Kelly talked about it, she talked about dialogue. And maybe from a PR perspective, we shouldn't keep on banging our heads against the wall. It's not working. And people are saying, you keep on talking to us. You just talk at us. There's no dialogue. And it brought to mind, is there potential to PR the dialogue? Is that not something that's promotable within tourism, within conservation? Can we not say dialogue in itself is a USP?
You must not like me, Jillian. I think if you look at, talking about the elephant in the room, the recent outburst of the whole Botswana situation, which I assume most people in this room are aware of, with the controversial white paper. I think if the responses have been based on very little knowledge of what's going on in the background. Mm-hmm. So you've got something that all of a sudden there's a huge big uproar, so one could say that was a PR disaster, but somebody could also say it's actually a PR opportunity. So, and the big thing I think that was a take home for me certainly was that, well, maybe this is a PR opportunity for Botswana to actually say this is now about dialogue. And it's about dialogue at grassroots levels where people can actually go back to the table and say, how do we do things and how have we done them traditionally, which is sitting under a tree for hours on end, swatting flies, and then at the end of the day coming up with a solution. And this is where it's going. And through that dialogue, people can actually follow that dialogue and get involved and perhaps contribute from the sidelines as opposed to dominate the conversation. So I think, yes, definitely there is some room there for PR on the dialogue that people living in those situations are actually having.
Yeah, and I think it is important, dialogue. Naledi, do you have anything else to say about how dialogue is just so important in these conversations, but it's also talking about that we're talking about it?
Right, no, I agree. And I think, especially when we're talking about a crisis, I think we almost have to operate in crisis mode on an ongoing basis. Because I think once we're dealing with a crisis, whether perceived or real, there's a lot more engagement between stakeholders and the public. And I think that needs to happen on an ongoing basis. So when something does happen, when there's something controversial, it's less impactful because everyone knows whenever anything happens anywhere on the continent, it has a negative impact on a country, whether they're hours away by plane or right next door. And so I think we have to sort of think about how we're communicating and who we're communicating with and just go into crisis mode on a daily basis, because then I think when things are truly a crisis, they're not as impactful because, you know, after a crisis, you'll see lots of stories, lots of engagement, lots of press releases, you know, symposiums and things like that, but that they're not necessarily happening to the same volume consistently.
Yeah. So, you know, it is something that we need to talk about. And I think the big thing with dialogue, so that we don't, not to say that there's a negative effect, but we have a lot of armchair conservationists from all over the world. Paul, from Safari Professionals' point of view, in this crisis mode, what do you do?
Well, we have a crisis PR consultant, and we go to her, and she advises us. And the two things she's advised us recently was the Uganda kidnapping. And a lot of our members got phone calls from concerned clients going to Rwanda, Uganda, obviously. And the advice was always stick to the facts. Get the facts first before you put anything out. And the second thing is remain positive, you know. And then you go from there. With regards to the elephant hunting white paper in Botswana, the media released this, in the media it was released, and of course we were blindsided in the USA. And I can speak for myself, from my company, my computer and phone lit up the next day. A lot of our clients were very, very concerned, and a lot of our members' clients were very, very concerned. So what do? We don't want to be blindsided, and we don't want to be caught off guard. So we contacted the Botswana ambassador, Ambassador Newman, and we asked him to engage with us, and he arranged a conference call, and we expressed our concerns and what our customers' concerns are about the situation, and in turn, he guaranteed to engage with the BTO and the minister and come back to us. So we take a proactive, we want the facts, and we want to be prepared. We know there's an announcement going to come out, but we need to be prepared. So when it does come out, we are also prepared to answer correctly and have the facts. That's what we do. Yeah.
Klara, do you think that there's an opportunity here?
Yeah, I say bring it on, you know. I want to hear about debates and controversy and differences of opinion. That's what makes a good story. It's drama.
Yeah. Kelly, do you think that, yes, as much as we
And
love
it's
to
educational.
debate,
And it's educational. I mean,
it's the way. Kelly, I know we love to debate, we all debate, but do you think that even from a domestic point of view, we have the tools sometimes from people sitting in Botswana to have an opinion? Because a lot of times we feel that, yes, it's all happening, but one of the things you pointed out was maybe they don't have as much information on why this discussion is even coming about.
Yes, no, 100%. And I think one of the aspects we need to do as Botswana is also tell our story very well, share it, and you have to understand why the dialogue started and why we are where we are. We need to do it well. And one of the aspects that actually came out today is once there's dialogue, people need to listen to each other. You need to listen why certain aspects came about. So definitely, I do agree. As Botswana, we just need to tell our story very well and ensure that everybody listens.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, we could have talked about this forever. We could have opened up for questions, but time is of the essence. And I think just to sum it up, we haven't come up with any conclusions. I hope that the people in this room can take on their role as facilitators, take on their role as implementers, to listen to some of the things that have been said, and maybe if you're thinking about your PR campaign in conservation and tourism, think about some of the things that we discussed, because we feel as a panel there's so much more opportunity. And very much like Ryan, Serge, and Paul say, it's not just one story, and that's the point of this. So thank you. Thank you to my panel.